I was personally working in local authorities near Kiev, which were actually occupied. So the Russians actually entered in 2022. And yeah, there was a lot of severe damage to the infrastructure, buildings, etc. So that strategic plan kind of was twofolded, trying to look at the future. So it's obviously evidence-led. We're co-created with the local people and trying to be inclusive. Well, they're trying actually being inclusive. So trying to predict the future, but still trying to respond to the immediate needs.
Hello, welcome to PlannerPod. This is the podcast of the Planner magazine, the RTPI's official member magazine. We're on episode 9. My name's Simon Wicks. I am the editor of the Planner, and today I have with me a very special guest, Marina Milosev, who is an urban planner and a Woman of Influence 2026. That's one of our Women of Influence. Hello, Marina. How are you?
Hello. Hi. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. We also have a special co-host, Nicola Gooch, who you may know is a regular columnist for the Planner. She'll be hosting with me today and bringing a bit of her normal sort of joy and insight and probably some references to musical theatre. Hi, Nicola. How are you?
I'm good, Simon. Good to be here.
Thank you very much for dropping in. We don't have Ben or Laura today. They're both indisposed. So it's just me and Nicola. You have to put up with us, and Marina, who I'm sure will be far more entertaining and interesting than we are. So let's kick off with Planner Picks. We have a new issue of the Planner that's just come out. It's got a really amazing photograph of Rachel Fisher, who is the new chief executive of the RTPI, on the cover with her dog Harmony, who's a Labradoodle. It's very dramatic. This is our kind of introductory interview to Rachel. So it's a sort of personal profile. I know that you may have some thoughts on this, Nicola.
I do. It was a fantastic interview, Simon, so well done. It actually feeds into a bit of the theme with this issue. There are quite a lot of us on a bit of a musical bent, but I've discovered personally that I share a favourite musical and a love of musical theatre with the new head of the RTPI, which is exciting.
What's the musical?
It was Into the Woods by Stephen Sondheim.
Okay. What's so special about that? I mean, I may have adopted one of the song titles from Into the Woods for the headline for the interview, but what's so special about Into the Woods?
Have you not seen it?
I'm not a musical theatre person, which is probably a terrible thing to say, given I've dropped all sorts of references to Into the Woods into the piece. But I may have been checking Google.
Okay, well, I'm about to completely derail this off the topic of planning. So Stephen Sondheim is a genius, in some ways the genius of musical theatre. His work is complex and layered and clever and subversive, and I say this as a performer, really bloomin' difficult to sing. Into the Woods is one of his classics. He's got several. Into the Woods is a really subversive story which takes fairy tales and turns them on its head. So there are many fairy tales in it. You've got Cinderella, you've got Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Beanstalk, Rapunzel, but weaving through them all is the story of a baker and his wife who are trying to have a child, and to do this they have to lift a curse.
Right.
And everyone ends up in the woods trying to get their stories through.
Yeah.
And you've got the baker and his wife trying to collect ingredients to lift this curse. And up until the end of Act 1, you're following the fairy tale stories, and at the end of Act 1, you're at the happily ever after. Get into Act 2.
I'm assuming at this point things turn on their head again.
Yes, completely.
I wonder whether we shouldn't leave our audience, who like me don't know Into the Woods, on tenterhooks at this point. But I mean, the reason we went with this is because when we asked Rachel what location she would like to be interviewed in and photographed in, more to the point, she mentioned the Parkland Walk in North London, which is a repurposed former railway line. It's been turned into a piece of green infrastructure, which she argues is more impressive than the High Line in New York. Yeah, one of her big passions is green infrastructure and its impact on places. See, we're coming back to planning now. And it just seemed very natural, Sondheim, Into the Woods, the idea of storytelling, of something magic happening within the woods as well. And there's lots of stuff around memory and, the intertwining of memory in the present day, which goes on. It all sort of felt very thematically relevant. But storytelling is a theme that we pick up quite a lot within the Planner. We like all music at the Planner. So we do have a bit of a thread running through the magazine over the years in which we explore the relationship between music and place, and art and place, and photography and place, and all different sorts of sort of artistic creations and the places we live in. We actually tend to think that's quite an important thing. So I'm wondering, there, and I'm sort of reaching a bit here, is there anything around this that might sort of evoke something for you, Marina? I mean, within your own work, is this something you've explored?
Not really. But as you're saying this, it kind of like is giving me ideas because it's such a fundamental part of, I think, of my daily life, particularly as I come from the Balkan region.
Yeah.
And I feel like you feel the beat on the streets as you land to Serbia or anywhere in the Balkan. And I feel like you can definitely see that energy on public spaces because there is a lot of loud music, which is kind of like, that Arabic influence of like, you want to move your body.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I really never thought from designing point of view or city point of view, although, again, as I said, like I do come from a place where, and just coming back from Azerbaijan, which is kind of like fairly similar, I was there and that also was very energetic and a lot of music going on spilled into public spaces. So it would be really interesting actually as a planner to think about harnessing that and how do we actually deal with something so important, particularly for certain culture and for everyone really in the world, into the work that we are doing.
So I'm just back from UK Reef, which is the big sort of UK property conference up in Leeds. It's sort of 3 days of just thousands of people talking about every aspect of property development and investment and all the rest of it, and planning and placemaking. And I attended a really interesting session, which was all around how we can bring the joy back into our cities and our spaces. And it kind of it looked at it from more of an architectural point of view. It was more about, how can we make buildings more joyful? But of course, inevitably, the conversation moved on to, well, what about the spaces between the buildings? Because actually, that's where the action takes place. And one of my feelings is that cities could be, or urban spaces, the places we live, do need to factor these things in. They do need to create spaces for something to happen. A few years ago, I covered the South Bank. Now, you may both know this skating area on London South Bank beneath the Royal Festival Hall. And there was a big campaign because the Royal Festival Hall, a lot of it had already been, it was designed when it was originally built. It was designed as a sort of free open space in which things would simply happen. It would find its own use, which was a really sort of risky thing to do, but a very bold and brave thing to do, I think. And the skaters discovered it pretty quickly. So it became this sort of skateboarding centre. And then eventually, bits of it were taken away for various storage reasons. And there was a threat to the entire thing a few years back. But the skaters themselves, rather brilliantly, started their own public campaign to save this space. And eventually they managed to persuade the Royal Festival Hall to open up the whole thing again, have this sort of wonderful skating space. It's a focal point. They just put that space in there, not knowing what it would be used for. Do you have any thoughts on that?
As you were talking, I'm just thinking how sometimes we need to stop maybe regulating too much and trying to prescribe too much. Sometimes life happens organically and people find their way into public spaces or they find a way to occupy, our cities in a more organic way. And of course, we've seen a lot of tactical urbanism where you're testing the idea sometimes. And I think that's beautiful because, you can at a low cost, or maybe, as you were saying, like unintentionally, create the space. But I think what is really, really important is that one, the space is created and brings the joy or is popular or, particularly cater for certain groups. I think then maybe we need to find a way to sort of regulate in a way to save those spaces. And that reminds me, obviously, I was working for LLDC, so Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And as I was working with, exploring gender and youth throughout the work, what we observe is that there is a group of teenagers who roller skate in a specific area, which is pretty much kind of like not let go of a space, but, our master plan was huge. So a lot of development was coming throughout the very long period of time. So there are a lot of meanwhile uses that we were also trying to build. But then there were these spaces that were just waiting for something to happen. And yeah, I think last time I was there a year ago, and it's incredibly popular. And you have this like a beautiful group of very diverse teenagers who are roller skating around. That's not something we planned, but it's definitely something that we started valuing. And, hopefully as the strategies progress, I'm sure my colleagues will take that into consideration.
I think they should. What about you, Nicola?
A little bit like the planning equivalent of Jurassic Park. Instead of life finds a way, community finds a way. If you give people the physical space and don't stop them, they will adopt it and start doing things with it. And then you will, I mean, to be fair, this is why a lot of the arguments about town and village greens and public rights of way happen, because there is just land and a gap in a fence, and then people just start. There is something wonderfully anarchic occasionally about communities and what they will do with the spaces around them.
One of the people on the panel got in touch with me this morning, actually, while I was on the train on the way up here. It was built on a book by Thomas Heatherwick, or the Heatherwick Studios, which talks about how we can bring joy back into our cities. And they very kindly gave me a copy. They were talking a lot about, rather than demolishing places, how can we repurpose them, make them more joyful, essentially, and make them more attractive, make them more engaging, make them more sort of integrated into our lives. We also talked somewhat about what it is in places that gives us a sense of joy. And a lot of it, to me, from what they were saying, seemed to come from some kind of sense of familiarity. This idea that something has always been there. It's always been a part of my life. It's always been within the landscape of my life. And so I have a lot of associations with it. Yeah, I can remember the time I split up with a girlfriend when I was walking past this building, or the time I met my best friend who just had a baby when I was walking past this building, or whatever. You associate memories. You build up associations through time and through place. And that is part of is one of the components of joy. And they said, very often we'll look at a building and think, that's very ugly, we can do better than that, let's knock it down and put something else up. And the panel was basically saying, well, no, let's not knock it down. Let's think about what the value, what the inherent and what the historical value of this place is, and how we can build on that. And so I put the question to them, what about new towns? So entirely blank spaces. So we're almost going back to what you were saying, Marina, about the Olympic Park, which was a blank space. And you kind of came across something accidentally.
I mean, building something from scratch, it is, a big challenge. And I think particularly, as we're going to be having new towns, and these are going to be major developments, which take time over a long period. And that obviously Olympic, although it was, quite kind of like a fast in a way, given the scale, I think the beauty maybe it is, as I said, in observing. So kind of like looking how these places start evolving as we are building them. And then I know that, we often do secure these kind of like outline planning permissions that kind of like set perimeters in place. But I feel like planning needs to find a way between creating something kind of like a, sturdy and certainty, but also be flexible. I mean, I'm a policy planner, and I always felt that, the way we operate in policy planning is like by the time we have adopted the local plan is out of date already. Like evidence in the life moved on. And I think for me, one of the things where I started rethinking the way we were doing planning and planning policy in particular, as I was doing that at the time, is during the COVID, where the life just turned upside down. So how do you allow flexibility, certainty? Of course, we need to negotiate developers. We still need to, plan for all of the housing. We need to know where we're going to allocate, all of the uses that we need. So we need planning. But how can we weave into some sort of at least flexibility into everything that we do so that we can sense, that we can look what works, what is maybe organically, as we were saying, happening, and in these major developments that we can respond to the people's needs or just the way they're using the places. So it's a tricky one, requires a lot of resources, requires a lot of people who can dedicate the time. And one of the things that I feel like we're definitely missing a lot in our profession is working with sociologists hand in hand. I would love to see them part of our team. One of the things when I was working on gender, I've learned the most the moment I've asked sociologists to walk me to actually explain to me how to talk to people, not how to talk, but how to listen, how to observe, how not to explain from technical point of view why the things are as they are and why they have to be that way, but to listen. And then also, what it is to be a human in the city. So yeah, I think, if we're creating this, it will be a magic if we had a lot of sociologists at the same time working alongside all of the technical people and helping us to collect these feedbacks and to reshape and be flexible and then gradually create something that actually really works.
It seems to me a lot of this is about trust. So if we're going to have a plan that has a flexible element within it, this unknown, people who are going to be on the other end of that plan, who are going to be living in and around it, need to feel they can trust the people who are shaping and delivering that plan to do something worthwhile, not to let them down. And this may be where your sociologists come in and your different ways of talking to people. Nicola, do you have any thoughts on this?
I was just thinking about Milton Keynes.
Go on.
Well, what you were saying about sociologists and the need to understand people when designing space and how we should get those conversations more involved in new towns. And it just got me thinking about the new towns and the forms of architecture we've already seen and how our thoughts about where we were going as a society and who we were as a people are just so explicit and literally writ large in our architecture and the way that certain places have been designed. And as one of the more recent and most successful new towns, obviously I was thinking about Milton Keynes and the roundabouts and the roads and the cows. The cows are incredible. But also 1960s brutalist architecture and where we were in the space when we were designing that and how it was all material of the future, very George Jetson inspired. These places look brilliant when they were new. It was just so typically 60s. If you think about that kind of streets in the sky aspiration. And I'm just wondering what we're doing now. What does it say about us? Because we don't seem to really have at the moment that same unifying through line or vision that is being played out in the same way. I can't really put my finger on what the now architectural movement is, really.
So I had a whole bunch of thoughts going through my head while you were saying that. The first of them is that, but Milton Keynes is about to be redeveloped quite substantially in the centre because all buildings and places embody a set of ideas, as you said, about how we should live. And planning essentially is there to answer the question, how should we live? And those ideas about how we should live change over time. They change with the political temperature, they change with the historical events and so forth, and how they sort of motivate us to think about the present and the future. And that was very much the case in the post-war era and the brutalist architecture and so on and so forth. In a lot of these new towns, a lot of this is being removed or covered up or hidden or redeveloped or knocked down. And they're undergoing this almost a transformation. It's almost as though the idea's time has passed. But at the same time, there's something valuable in keeping that. So we come back to this idea of familiarity. What brings us joy? Very often it's not something that's actually beautiful to look at. It's something that we have associations with. It's something that's always been there. It's something that's been part of our lives. And so that was my first point. I have several. The second point is that if you really want two really good evocations of this sense of aspiration, put it that way. One, bringing us back to music, is an artist called Warrington Runcorn Newtown Development Plan. His name is actually Gordon Chapman Fox. We interviewed him a few years ago. His music is amazing, and it's all about the Newtown experience. He's released album after album after album, looking at different aspects of the philosophy of new towns, the planning of new towns, the marketing of new towns, which is interesting, what life was like within these new towns, and the decay of new towns as well. So there's something quite mournful, and there's a kind of mournful eloquence about his work, which is really rather beautiful, and it's very ambient as well. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I have a photographer friend called Jeff Pitcher, who lives in Crawley, which was a new town. And he's an amazing photographer. But he laments the decline and the loss of the new town aspects of Crawley that make it the Crawley he knows and loves. And he's got a series, a sort of ongoing informal series that he adds to from time to time, called In Search of the Newtown Ghosts, in which he finds these little fragments, these lost remaining fragments of the new town of Crawley and photographs them. So I recommend both of those to you. So, Marina, you're our guest today. We've sort of introduced you. You're a woman of influence, you're an urban planner. You come from the Balkans, as you said, it's Serbia, right? You have worked in London for the London Legacy Development Corporation and the Old Oak Park Royal project. You run or co-run a planning consultancy called Beyond the Red Line. You've worked in the field of inclusivity, gender equality in particular. But I'd like to know, about the work that you've just been doing. Would you like to tell us about that, please?
Yes, well, thank you for your introduction. That's all correct. Yes, you're getting me in a very interesting time as I'm transitioning and trying to rest, but also work, and I guess also reflecting on my experience. I was with United Nations, UN Habitat in Ukraine. So I spent 11 months in Kiev on the ground working on what I can, from a personal perspective, say, I think, assignment of my, I think, professional and personal kind of like a life, if I can say. Yeah, so I've joined UN in Kiev, sort of maybe foolishly thinking, oh, who else is going to apply to go to Ukraine? But of course, that it's a highly kind of like a competitive process, as always is with the UN. Really, I think my main motivation when I saw at the time when I applied, I was doing my consultancy, so I've done a couple of interesting projects. But when I saw the opportunity to join Ukraine, it was just something I could not apply and put myself forward. And the reason really being is, well, on a personal level, as you said, I do come from Serbia. So really my childhood was marked by unfortunate war and later in 1990 NATO aggression. So I kind of like lived through the time of actually understanding what urban development does in the post-war countries. And is not something that only builds infrastructure, but actually builds dignity in life of people. Unfortunately, in my country, that really didn't happen. And the reason why I left to pursue my career elsewhere was because the opportunities were not here. And it's something that for me is kind of like quite a deep wound because, although it's beautiful to have experience internationally, always long to be where, with our family and with our friends. So kind of like recognizing one aspect of what actually does rebuilding infrastructure to human life, particularly after such a disaster, was one motivation. And the other was, I thought, well, I kind of have experience and I know life is not that bad. You might kind of like a fear if you're looking from the outside. So I will volunteer myself to, be with people and be there because, yeah, I assume kind of like I wouldn't be scared of that. And I mean, that's exactly kind of like as it find out.
So, what were you actually doing in Ukraine? What was your work?
So actually, it's really interesting. And I will just give a little bit of a background because I think it's quite intriguing for a local planner to work in such environment. First of all, before the war, Ukraine decentralized its planning system. So I'm saying this because it's very important to what we were doing. So much more responsibility was given to local authorities to create a local plan, which is something that hasn't happened before. And the legislation was obviously adopted and enforced when the war started. Following the onset of 2022 Russian occupation, full-scale invasion on Ukraine, the life still goes on. Like the cities still at some degree need to be developed. But of course, now there is an element of quite a lot of distractions. So the work that we were doing, we were working directly with the local planning authorities, and we were preparing the strategic local plans, which were two types of local plans currently in Ukraine, which is something adopted later on. And one is looking at the local municipalities that were severely affected. And I was personally working in local authorities near Kiev, which were actually occupied. So the Russians actually entered in 2022. And yeah, there was a lot of severe damage to the infrastructure, buildings, etc. So that strategic plan kind of was twofolded, trying to look at the future. So it's obviously evidence-led. We're co-created with the local people and trying to be inclusive. Well, they're trying actually being inclusive. So trying to predict the future, but still trying to respond to the immediate needs. And it's very challenging. It's very, very challenging when you need to respond to something immediate, but still trying to fit that into this long-term sustainability. On the other end, we were creating another type of strategic local plans, which the level of distractions were less, but the huge impact from internally displaced people would put a lot of pressure on the infrastructure. So kind of like a two-folded way of through planning dealing with war and the crisis. And I think maybe kind of like apart from building the plan, which, it's always good to have, I think probably the biggest influence that we have was capacity building, kind of like a bringing, not imposing our methodology or the way of working. We were very much working with a local implementing partner, but sort of like as a international experts, we were bringing the best practice from international best practice, particularly UN methodologies, but adapting it and being very sensitive that that is actually being applicable to the local context. So for me, it was very much as well learning from Ukrainians, their way of working, learning from them as much as trying to kind of like steer or maybe help in certain elements as we were doing, just kind of like maybe bringing the practice that works elsewhere and could be adapted in the local context.
You talked about planning is about thinking about the future, and you talked about the demands of the immediate present, anticipating what the future might be. But it's a very dynamic situation. It could all change in a moment if a bomb drops, if an army moves in. It's such a dynamic and dangerous situation as well, and so volatile. Was that something that was sort of a factor in your thinking while you were doing this work?
So, yes, we embarked at the beginning helping with certain plans, which were legislative plans. And we actually realized that because it needs to go, as everywhere you would assume, through the levels of governance and adoption, we actually realized that that is way too long of a process, just because it was a statutory plan, to actually have an impact that we needed to do, which was the most immediate. Because we were, of course, operating as well and working with other UN sister agencies who were IOM or UNICEF, who would come with the ready proposals or funding or etc. or like donors, and they would be like, okay, we need to know now and here what needs to be rebuilt based on the evidence, etc. And we just felt that the adoption of the process was a little bit, we were following the procedures, so there was like nothing we could do about that. But what we kind of like towards the end start exploring, and we wrote the methodology, is actually looking how can we create what we call rapid planning urban methodology. So responding to the needs of actually having to act, kind of what is the right balance between the long-term planning and sustainability, which absolutely needs to be present, but also like what is the balance of that to responding to the needs and hostilities, as you said, rightly so. So yes, absolutely, towards the end of this program, and hopefully something that the office there will continue to explore, is the rapid urban planning methodology. I think we have a different word for that, but that's where we started, what we settled on calling it.
I was just thinking, what a wonderful expression of hope and faith in the future progressing a strategic statutory plan during a war actually is. The ability to hold that vision of what you're building towards in the midst of such adversity. It's a really phenomenal expression of the human spirit.
Yes. Incredibly resilient people, and people who are absolutely looking into the future. And when we were talking, so we would have this, of course, participatory engagement, and we'll talk with people. What really struck me is that often the conversation was about pre-existing issues. So the war, it does get mentioned, but it's more like future and maybe something that dated from the past. To the point that we actually, having worked in the region of Chernobyl, like we spend considerable time talking about still the consequences of Chernobyl. So yes, it's incredible how humans adapt and how resilient they can be, and how actually, I don't want to say little and minimize at all, but our discussions and discourse was not only about the war and the public participations. And one of the things, for example, that came over and over again, and then I was leading particularly part of the project that we were looking at the public spaces, was actually talking about retaining the youth, not only because of the war, but also because, all of the economic situation and, just what it happens in, I guess, Eastern Europe, and I'm from Southeast. So knowing the brain drain and, youth going towards the West where they can find job more easily. So the priority number one for people were how to retain the youth. And again, this is, part due to the war, but also from the pre-existing issue and looking at the future. So yeah, absolutely. Working on a long-term strategic plan, it was not something that we've seen being rejected or an obstacle or having like kind of like why you're thinking about that. Actually, people felt pride of how they want to move and how they see themselves.
I think this is extraordinary. I think possibly this is the way that we cope with extreme trauma, is by somehow boxing it off, neutralizing it in some way, numbing ourselves to some extent, and directing our minds towards things that are perhaps more everyday and less dramatic. I mean, as you were speaking, two thoughts came to my mind. One was, years ago, I remember reading George Orwell's war journalism. And of course, he continued to write throughout the Second World War. And he would write about all sorts of stuff. So he would write about the political situation. He would write about the war itself. He would also write about all the everyday things that people kept on doing, even though they were in the middle of, the Battle of Britain or the Blitz, or, their lives were completely disrupted or turned upside down. Actually, people clung to, even more than ever, the normal, the everyday, the routine and the regular. And I was really quite stunned. I remember reading this because I'd been brought up in the 1970s where the war was very present, but it was dealt with as this sort of dramatic thing that was in movies, and it was action and stuff happening all the time, and it was really big. Actually, people have to go about their lives through these things. And it sounds to me as though you've had very much that kind of experience. The other thought that came into my head, and we'll come back to this in a moment, is some years ago I worked for a period in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and it was just a couple of years after the Good Friday Agreement. And I was very, very conscious that this was a city in a post-traumatic state. It was extraordinary. People had lived through so much for so long, and when they talked about it, which they didn't very much, it was almost surreal. They were describing experiences that were kind of distant and yet very close. And they couldn't really believe that things were normal. And that was very unusual. So there was a whole issue there about how you rebuild not just a city or a place. And of course, Belfast is notorious for its peace walls, but how you rebuild a sense of community and a sense of normality once the abnormal thing has been removed from your lives, because it doesn't really go away. Do you have any thoughts on that, Marina?
Yes, I think one thought comes to my mind from a personal experience growing up in Serbia, and I feel like the grieving comes later. When grieving is almost like a luxury, when you have time and when you feel enough safe to reflect to what just happened, and that can come many years later. I know, for example, in Belgrade, there was one building in the city center that was quite destroyed. Anyway, not to go into the recent politics of rebuilding that and a huge opposition from people, but it's almost like as much as we wanted to move on as fast as possible and rebuild our lives, that building after many years stood as a reminder and as something that we can remember and grieve of what happened. So I absolutely agree. I think is that how rebuilding in a sense that the life goes back to normality. People need that at a time. But how do you create the spaces that after, a couple of years or many years later, people can come back to self-reflect and, I guess, grieve those years and those moments. And again, one of the very interesting things that came over and over again through all of our consultation as a highest priority of people are public spaces. So I almost feel like whether, that is the place where you want to rebuild the dignity. I mean, unfortunately, in Ukraine, there are many young men and women, but obviously particularly men with war-related disabilities. And that is very noticeable as you're walking through the town, and very disturbing and very shaking and sad. The landscape of the cities is very much Soviet, so there are big boulevards. So there's a lot of barriers in using the city and walking through the cities. And to me, that was like one of the most important things is like, how do we create the places where everyone, no matter of the disability or maybe hidden disability like trauma, can utilize the city and can come as a community. And I feel like that life happens in public spaces. And again, this is not something that we were trying to force onto, but it was something that kept coming as a priority from the local residents. Public spaces may be something that should kind of like take that function of healing.
I almost don't know what to say to that. It's not something we think about very much, is it? And yet this idea that a city can contribute to, or at least give a space for healing, grieving, coming to terms with things. Because I suppose our instinct is once something is done is to erase it. knock it down, rebuild over it. But of course, we know from the past that whenever we've had sort of large-scale communal traumatic events, we need a memorial of some sort. I think it's interesting to make that memorial a public space. What do you think, Nicola?
This is an incredibly profound, emotional, and quite deep conversation for a planning podcast, is my primary thought. The work that you're doing, Marina, is inspiring and important. I think really goes to the heart of what planning as a profession does and can do. At its heart, what are we doing? We are shaping communities, and those communities all have experiences that need to be honoured and recognised, and that can take a long time. And even in this country, communities hold traumas for very long times, and I think we've all seen recent examples of that just here, let alone everything else everywhere else. And finding a space for that, I think, is something which I say this as a child born in 1984 who grew up in England in a period of quite unusual, from a historic perspective, stability. So for me, it wasn't necessarily something that I ever really had to grapple with or think about until now, until this stage of my life where things are becoming a little less settled again. But it is actually vitally important that we do make space for this type of thing, both emotionally and literally.
So in a way, we're coming back around to this issue of memory that we began with. We were talking about being in the woods and being in a place that is separate, that is unreal, that is kind of divorced from the everyday reality. Experiencing things within the woods and then coming back into the real, into Act 2, which I prevented you from talking about. How did they deal with things in Act 2, Nicola, of Into the Woods?
There's a lot of trauma in Act 2.
There you go.
And a lot of blame. There are 3 or 4 songs in the second half of Into the Woods which are about blame. One of them is called Your Fault / The Last Midnight, which is all of the characters blaming each other for, in this instance, the mother of the giant coming down and trashing everybody's homes because her son was murdered by Jack at the end of Act 1. And in the end, they all do just end up pulling together as a community to rebuild their lives. And Sondheim does it beautifully, and the music is incredible.
So, Marina, let's come back to you. And we're back to this issue of memory, experience, trauma, and how it can be played out, expressed, and potentially even resolved within the built environment. You talked about healing. Now, you've been through the experience, you've lived through 2 wars, war in Serbia, where you grew up, and voluntarily war in Ukraine. What's your take on healing? And of course, your work with London Legacy Development Corporation is also in a way about restoring and regeneration, isn't it? And you have a big thread in your work around equality, inclusivity, which you've touched on. Do you feel that the work that you've been doing in Ukraine somehow pulls together some of these different threads of your life and your work?
Absolutely. I think my work from my whole career has really been about social justice. Again, really coming from my personal life experience than from something that I've learned through the books. But I definitely have seen how planning can influence, not resolve. Obviously, it's a big systemic issue, social inequality, but it is reflected in the way we design our cities. And when it's reflected also, then if we're, mindful about it, we can as well, change the course. So yeah, social justice is definitely something that, drives me in the work. I don't think originally I wanted to be a planner. That somehow happened. And then as I was like, kind of like a midway through my career, I was like, oh, can I change my profession now? And then I stood and I was like, no, I don't need to change profession. I need to change how I relate to the profession. I can bring myself, I can bring my ideas, I can bring my philosophy, I can bring my personal experience. And more importantly is I'm going to listen more about the lived experience of the people I'm designing or creating the spaces for. And to me, the social justice is people being heard. And then to me, as of that moment, I just become the technical expert to translate those needs into something that works within the system that we know. That's why I need to go back. It kind of like, in a way, I really wish that, designing the cities would come as a brief from, sociologists, psychologists, and people together to tell us what is the future they envision, what is the world they want to live in, and then we find a technical solution to create that, rather than us kind of like maybe embedding our bias into the ways that we're doing, or the bias from the books that we've learned, because the question is always who wrote that. A lot of people who wrote the books are often as well, privileged to be at those positions. So yes, absolutely. I think what kind of like brought me there was that opportunity to create something meaningful and do a meaningful work, and bring the knowledge that I have, but also, my personal experience.
We come back to this issue about how place represents who we are, essentially, and perhaps who we are in a very deep, native, instinctual way. And again, as you were speaking, it reminded me of a piece we had in the Planner some years ago, written by, he was kind of a health researcher, I think. His name was Gustav Milne. He had worked with a big medical body, the Wellcome Trust, possibly, on a project called the Evolutionary Determinants of Health. And essentially, his work revolved around how, as he put it, we are Paleolithic creatures living in highly technological societies. And we've built cities that are antithetical to our Paleolithic instincts, which haven't evolved at the same rate as our technology and our social governance structures. And his work was moving towards an understanding of how we can build a city that would be more sympathetic or empathetic towards our Paleolithic instincts. In other words, make us feel more comfortable and more human within the city. And what I found really intriguing about this, apart from that basic premise, which is just interesting in its own right, was the fact that the solutions he came up with were very, very much like the solutions that other people coming from other disciplines, coursing through planning, are also coming up with around well-being, health, happiness, access to nature, greenery, all of these things that make us feel better in physical spaces. And it struck me there are a variety of different ways of reaching the same answer. And if we're all reaching the same answer, perhaps it's the right one. Do you have any thoughts on that, Nicola?
I'm deep in thought, because that is a very, very deep place to have gone.
I've never seen you speechless.
It's in part because you also opened this with Into the Woods, so I currently have the finale of a musical running through my head whilst I am trying not to sing and to be deep and honour a really important discussion. And to be fair, I think possibly the way to end it is actually with the lyrics of Into the Woods, which is called Children Will Listen. So it's careful the things you say, children will listen. Careful the things you do, children will see and learn. Children may not obey, but children will listen. Children will look to you for which way to turn, to learn what to be. And it just goes on about the need for us to think probably more about the impact that what we're doing has on the people who follow after us. A lot of this is actually about ensuring that the steps that we take now are setting a path that we as a society want to follow, both in terms of built environment, in terms of health, in terms of recognising that we are people and we are going to have to live in these spaces, about taking the long-term view, about jumping musicals entirely, recognising that everything may not be awesome right now, but we can build towards something that is. Sorry, Marina, that is a very deep cut to my own column in this planning edition, which is all about the Lego Movie 2.
So we've now gone from Into the Woods to the Lego Movie, George Orwell, and more esteemed characters. So when we started this podcast, I had a bit of a plan, and it's just gone out the window completely. But actually, it's been really enjoyable and really, really interesting. But we do, unfortunately, have to wrap up, which I'm really sorry about, because I do feel we could keep talking for a long time. Marina, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you on. Your life and work are utterly fascinating, and I know that I could talk to you for hours about this. You will be with us, I hope, at the Women of Influence reception on the 9th of June. So this podcast should come out just a couple of days before that. So if anybody is going to the Women of Influence reception, please go and say hello to Marina. She's incredibly interesting. Nicola's also going to be there, and she'll sing for you, she tells me. Yeah, she just does requests. She's great. I'll be there as well, but I'm not remotely interesting. Nicola, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you again. Marina, thank you very, very much indeed. That was really, really moving, actually.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
I think the word inspirational gets used a lot, but the work that you're doing really is, Marina, and it's important. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And that's it from episode 9 of PlannerPod. I hope we didn't make you cry, but we got in some really big issues. Keep an eye out for the next issue of the magazine, which will be in another 2 months. The current one is out today. It's got a really great interview with Rachel Fisher. We also have articles about the land use framework and about marine planning, which is very interesting too. We'll see you at the Women of Influence reception if you go. If not, hopefully we'll see you anyway. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.